Installation, Part 2. In this nugget, we continue our discussion of installations, and this is Part 2, where we start off by talking about installation media. If you got the patience for it, for example, you could actually install Windows XP from floppy disks. Wow, wouldn't that be a mess? You can also do it from a CD or a DVD. That's more commonly the way that it's done, at least on a single basis. But for corporations, very often we'll use imaging or install Windows from a Windows deployment server. We'll take a look at some of those options. We'll also take a look at some installation notes just in general. And this relates to things such as the fact that you can install additional drivers during the setup process and where the log files are located and things like this. And there's also installation options. And for this, you can do things such as selecting a unattended installation where all of the answers are provided for the installation and you don't have to babysit the whole installation all the way through. And we also discuss a little bit about partitioning and product keys and activation. Have you ever intended to say something nice, but you didn't get the words out quite right and it got a little misinterpreted? That happened to me recently when I decided to take my wife down to Starbucks. And being the gentleman that I am, I let her in line in front of me and she placed her order. Now, you have to understand, my wife is a fit, trim, beautiful woman. She's an athletic person, and so she's a really beautiful woman. And she placed an order for a tall, non-fat raspberry mocha with whip. Now, in my mind, I said, with whipped cream. Doesn't that kind of offset the effect of the non-fat milk? But out loud, I said, gee, non-fat, do you think that's really going to help? Well, I got kind of a dirty look there from her, and the girl behind the counter shot me a look, and the ladies behind me in line there, they gave me a few dirty looks as well as some words that were exchanged, and well, just suffice it to say that I don't really show my face in that Starbucks anymore, because I found out that the people there aren't very nice. Apparently, they just don't understand how I communicate. Anyway, it's kind of like that with installation as well. Now, you're not going to use non-fat milk when you do your installation. However, you do want to plan carefully. You don't want something to be rash, like the words that came out of my mouth. You want to plan in ahead and know what you're going to do before you get there. You have a little bit of a roadmap. The best way to do that is to have a good understanding of what's involved in the installation. And for that, one of the first things we need to address is the various installation methods or installation media that you can use. And in planning your installation, the first thing you need to know is how you're going to get it done, what media you're going to use. Now, in the old days, we used to use floppy disks. This would be back in the days of like Windows 3.1 or Windows for Workgroups 3.11. This is, over a decade ago, a long, long time ago. And this was kind of impractical, but back in the day, we didn't really have a lot of CD or DVD-ROM drives. Everything was done with a floppy disk. But the operating systems were also a lot smaller back then. Nowadays, that's not really practical. In fact, current operating systems, you don't even have that option to use floppy disks. I only really bring it up because it still appears on the A+ exam for reasons unknown to me. But anyway, I guess you could still do this with Windows XP back in the day if you did not have a CD or a DVD-ROM drive. There was an option where you can install Windows XP only from floppy, but it's very impractical and it takes forever. So this is really a bad idea. But more commonly, you're going to install from a CD if you're using something like Windows 2000, Windows XP, or more current versions of Windows will use a DVD because there's too much to fit on a CD. So be aware of that as well for current operating systems, just other options. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that whichever boot method you're going to use here, you especially want to make sure that the BIOS is set up with the proper boot order. So that, for example, if you want to install Windows Vista from a DVD, make sure that the BIOS is configured to boot from the DVD first. And then you could also perform the installation from a USB flash drive. But before I get to that, let me just demonstrate the CD or DVD method. And by way of example here, I'm powering off the screen here where you can't see it right now. I'm powering on a Windows machine. It's actually not a Windows machine, it's a bare metal machine, but it's in VMware. And I'm just kind of dragging the VMware window into this. And we can see that by pressing escape during the post, that VMware allows me to select which installation method I want to use, whether it's a hard drive, a DVD-ROM, or a CD-ROM drive, or a network boot. Now, various computers will have different options for this. It may show you something in the initial startup that says which key to press. Mine, I just happen to know that it's the escape key that brings this up. Also, however, I could choose a default option in the BIOS, and again, choose something like the CD-ROM drive, which is what I'm doing right here. And by doing so, then when I press Enter, you'll see here that Windows is loading the files. Kind of drag this into the screen here. Windows is loading the files, and then I would start to get the wizard going, and I would just next finish through the installation process as it goes on. And then after a few seconds, you'll see a screen much like this one, where you'll just, of course, proceed on through the rest of the installation process. Now, you can also choose to use a network installation media. This could take place a couple of different ways. For example, a lot of people back in the old days would use this website right here, and you can notice it up there at the top. And this would be Bart's Boot Disks. You can create floppy disks or CD-ROMs that allow you to boot to, for example, the network here. And it gives you pretty thorough instructions on how to create all of this. It's a lot of work, though. Right now, it's probably more practical or popular to install a Windows operating system using Microsoft's Windows deployment services. But before we get to that, let me show you an example of this network item right here. I have an old disk that I sometimes use. I don't really need it much anymore, but just by way of illustration, I'll show you that I can boot from a CD that I kind of custom cobbled together. I can connect to a share over the network, and then I can install Windows from that share. So, for example, here I'm again booting up VMware, and I'm going to press the escape key here. Whoops, press the escape key if I can hit it in time. You got to really hit this right on the button or else you miss it. And I seem to keep missing it. There it goes. Okay, so this is now booted from a CD-ROM that I have, and now you can see that it's just booting up. You don't need to memorize all the steps or any of this stuff. There's Bart's name there, who's the guy who invented a lot of this stuff. And then I'll just go ahead and run the network client. And I'll just process one that I custom configured called, VMware, because this is booting from within the VMware environment. Now you can see here, I can specify which IP address I want to use, which gateway, any account information that I want to specify. And I'm going to kind of abort all of this here shortly and back out of it, because we don't really need to go through the rest of that. But that's just an example of how you can boot to the network. Further on, I could then connect to a network share and then launch an installation. It's much easier and more practical in the corporation, however, to use Windows Deployment Services, or WDS. And for that, I'm going to just show you my Windows Server 2008 server, my R2 server, which is actually in production. And you can see here it has installed as a role Windows Deployment Services. Now, none of the stuff that you see here is anything that you need to memorize for A+ exam objective purposes. But I want to give you a little more sense of context in what we're actually looking at here. This WDS server is configured with some install images. I just have to get the original, ISO or the DVD for each one of these operating systems. And then what you do with this is you just simply right-click here and choose Add Install Image, and it takes you through a little wizard, which then adds the bits for these installations right here. And there's a lot of really cool stuff about this. But anyway, the main idea with this is if I go back now to my a bare metal item here where I want to install, then I would specify that I want to boot from the network card. And what happens is it gets an IP address from a DHCP server, which I'll talk more about later on in a future nugget. And then what it does is it's able to identify, let me give ourselves a little bit more room here. Drag this over. It identifies a number of different operating systems that I could then install if I wanted to. For example, there's that Windows Vista Service Pack 2 that I mentioned earlier. This is all coming from that server that I mentioned over on the other side there that we looked at, my DC1 server. So it's got an IP address. It's starting to load Windows files. I don't have to chase down DVD-ROMs or hope that they're not scratched or any of that kind of stuff. And if I have good network bandwidth, this is probably going to be a little bit faster installation as well than installing from a DVD. This can also use multicasting, so I can deploy to multiple clients at once. Very practical for many corporate environments. Now, I'm going to go ahead and proceed through the rest of the installation just so that we can kind of get a sense of context for the installation itself. This window that you're looking at right here comes from the server. If you install off of a DVD, you don't see this same interface right here. What we do is choose the locale and the keyboard or input method. This will be chosen again at a later point in time, but the point of this right now is because I need to enter in credentials for whoever's doing this installation, because you can assign permissions to all those different operating systems that are available from the WDS server. And you can give different people privileges for different installations. For example, I wouldn't want my help desk to install Windows Server 2008 because that could cost thousands of dollars. We would want them to install that accidentally or on purpose on some user's desktop. So I might just give them the permissions to install Windows Vista only. Here I'll go ahead and click on Next, and then I'll enter in some credentials. And once I've done that, it'll prove that I have the ability or the authority to install whichever version of Windows that I'm looking for. Now that I've entered in those credentials, you can see here that I have pretty much full permissions over any operating system that I've got up there. Just as a brief note here, you can see x64 editions, and you may also see 32-bit editions. Let me see if I got any. I guess I'm only using 64-bit editions. That's because all of my processors are 64-bit. We'll talk more about that at a later point in time. But you can see here, for example, I can install Windows Server 2008 Data Center Edition. That costs thousands of dollars, and I wouldn't want just a help desk person that normally works on desktops to install that one, for example. Okay. Then we also have Windows 7 Professional and Ultimate. Notice that this is right here, Dell T410 Capture. What operating system is that? That's actually my server. You can also use WDS servers to capture images. We'll talk more about images at a later point in time, but I captured this, when was that? Back in July of 2009, because that was the new server back then. I wanted to capture it in its brand new state in case, for some reason, I had to go back to a previous point in time with it. Now, there's other different and better probably backup methods than just that, but I could also use that image to deploy a copy of the server through multiple other servers, provided I had the licensing and the hardware was compatible. Now, in our case, I'm just going to choose, how about Windows Vista Ultimate 64-bit edition? Actually, I'd like to install the one with Service Pack 2. If I install this one, it's already got the Service Pack installed and slipstreamed into the bits. If I choose this one, I'll have to install the Service Pack anyway, and it's a lengthy installation with a big download, so I'll just choose this one instead and click Next on through. And then here I have to identify which hard drive I want to install this on. If I've already got an existing operating system and partitions, they will appear here. If I decide I want to wipe some of those out, I can go to Drive Options down here in Advanced and choose Delete and get rid of those partitions. And then I can also, of course, create new partitions and then format them. Now, in reality, Windows, if it sees just unallocated space like this, which doesn't have a partition or a format, it'll just automatically partition it and then format it. But the official A+ answer is probably going to be more like that you need to take your space here, create a new partition, specify how big you want that to be. You know, I would click Apply. Now I've got a partition there, after which, after that's been created then, I would then have to format it. So the official answer there is you have to create a partition, then format, then install the operating system on it. In my case, just because I want to prove that, it is possible, I'm going to go ahead and delete that partition, like I said you can do. I'm just going to install it on the raw empty space there, and Windows itself will automatically partition and then format all of that. Then after it's gone ahead and partitioned and formatted the drive, you get this interface right here, which explains itself pretty well. Then you go ahead and click on Next. Here, you do need to enter in a product key. Now, you don't technically have to. You could leave this blank. However, you will not be able to activate it if you leave it blank. Very often what I'll do is I'll leave the product key blank and clear this item. Why would I want to do that? Well, this would be the case if it's a test machine and I'm not sure that it's going to be compatible with the operating or with the applications we're running or with the hardware. If I suspect there might be other problems that could pop up and I'm just testing things out. Because I don't want to burn an activation and pay for an activation if it turns out I won't be able to use that installation of Windows anyway. So I'll usually leave this empty until I've tested everything out. And then once it's been tested properly, and I find out that it's good, you can go into the system properties, enter the product key, and then activate it, and you'll be just fine. But I'll just usually leave this blank right now. It'll complain at me here in a moment that I've left it blank, but that's okay, and that'll be fine. I'll just go ahead and click also that I accept the basic license terms, but since I haven't entered in which operating system I want to, or rather which product key that I need to use, then if I were installing this from a Windows DVD, it would ask me which edition of Windows I was trying to install. With a WDS deployment, like you saw me use, one of the very first things I did was choose Windows Server, or rather Windows Vista Ultimate 64-bit edition. So it already knows that now because I'm using WDS and I made that selection early on. If I had not done that and I installed from DVD, I would have to specify that in the interface. We just don't see it here. So I'm just going to enter in, some credentials here. And you can enter in a password hint if you like as well. And of course you can choose your own cute little picture. I'll just choose a kitty cat because that's how I am, nice and cuddly. And then I guess I actually have to enter in a password hint here. So this would be something that would remind you of what your password was in case you forgot it, of course. Then as we click on Next, you can enter in the name for this computer as well. I think I'll just name this one, how about Vista 64 or something like that. So Vista 64, since it's a 64-bit operating system. Then, of course, you can choose, some background that you like here as well. Click on Next. You can choose whether or not to use Windows Update. Of course, for most environments, I would recommend using the recommended settings. You could also choose Install Important Updates Only. This would be like security updates. Or just ask me later if you don't really want to decide right now. For home users, the recommended is very much the one you should select. For corporations, it doesn't really usually matter which one you select, because they're very often controlled by something called a group policy, and a Windows Server Update Services server, where the corporate servers will automatically update your clients, and they will kind of take this choice away. It just forcibly applies those updates. I'm going to use recommended settings for our instance. And you choose, of course, which time zone you're in. I'm in Arizona, so I'll choose that one. And then as we click on Next, it'll identify also that I'm connected to the network. Now, we'll talk more about network location awareness in a future nugget, but that's what this relates to. And that's where it wants to know if you're at work, a public location, home. And the reason why it does that is because depending upon the context, it can change the firewall rules. So I'm at work, as opposed to something like a Wi-Fi in an airport or a coffee shop or something like this. So I'll choose work, and that's pretty much it. Now I have my installation of Windows, and before long here we'll see the start menu and everything appear. Now, I'm not really elaborating on this, but what's going on right now is it also checks the computer's performance. It checks the amount of hard drive space it has, the speed of the hard drive, the video, the amount of memory it has, all those sorts of things. And this can relate to whether or not you're able to play certain things such as high-end games and the like. And then here, as I was mentioning earlier, we come to a login where I'll then be able to get my desktop and the start menu and so forth. I think I typed that password in right. Okay, and then we enter that in, and here we go. And then here we go, we now have a desktop. Now, I did close the Welcome Center screen that appeared at first when you log on. It's just kind of tiresome to see that every time, so I kind of just get rid of it. You can turn that off so it doesn't appear anymore when you log on to the computer. Also, I want to point out that one thing we did not see here in this installation that you might see in previous versions of Windows is that there was no place to choose which components you want. For example, whether or not I want to install various games and the like. Here with Windows Vista, you choose that after the fact by going to Control Panel, and then going to Programs, and then you can choose from this point, instead of it being Add Remove Programs, you would go here to turn Windows Features on or off. And then we'll have a user account control prompt, and that's what this is right here. We'll talk about that in more detail at a later point in time. And then I got some updates that apply there, so let me minimize those for the time being. And then you can choose, do I want to uninstall these games? Do we not really want these? Do I want to install the indexing service? Anything else that was not included in a default installation of Windows that you might want to include. I'm just going to cancel all that for the time being, though. Another way of performing an installation is to use an existing installation and make a copy of it. That's what we call imaging. So there's a couple of different products that do this. There's actually several, but probably one of the more popular ones is Ghost. That's from Symantec. There's also an Acronis product. I use the workstation edition of this, although there's a number of different products that Acronis makes that are available. And what I've done with that is just offline here. In other words, I paused recording and did this while you weren't looking. That same installation that we just completed, I installed Acronis Backup and Recovery 10. And by the way, I don't get any endorsement dollars or anything for mentioning these companies. They don't even know who I am. Although I wish they would give me their product, because actually it's pretty good. But what this does is it backs up an image, in this case, of the entire hard drive. And this will take a little while, especially on the first backup, because it backs up absolutely everything. The advantage of this, however, is that at a later point in time, if I want to, I can take that image and reapply it to the same machine. For example, what if I back this whole machine up, and in this case I'm backing it up to a network location, so it's not on the same physical hardware as the operating system. And then what if the hard drive just failed and I had to completely replace it? Geez, I don't want to have to go through that whole thing of reinstalling Windows and reinstalling all of my apps and digging up all my data. Who knows where that is and all that. So instead, what I could do is just put the new hard drive in, boot from the CD-ROM for Acronis Backup and Recovery, and then it would allow me to connect to the network location and apply that image that I'm creating right now back to a bare hard drive, and it's exactly the same as the image that I took. It's really a very ingenious method for being able to recover things. I can also use the same product as well as Ghosts to recover just individual files. Maybe I just lost one file. I don't want to reinstall the operating system. I just lost a file. I can recover that using these tools as well. And then to round this out, let me also show you what I would do if I wanted to recover. And again, I'm not trying to teach you Acronis software. There's a number of different alternatives to do the same kind of thing we're looking at here, including the fact that you can use Windows' own backup utility, which allows you to create an image of the hard drive, although it's much less flexible than using third-party products like this. But what I would do is I would just click Recover, and then you'd have to fill in some blanks. You'd have to point to the archive that you had stored, which remember mine was over on a server, and then you would see the system reboot. And then after you've done that, it should come right back to a desktop like this where you can log on and see the same desktop. In fact, the truth is I've already tested that and done that. The desktop, let me minimize this. The desktop we're looking at right here is a restored image. I already did it offline just to test it on my own, and there it is. So again, this could be a completely brand new computer, this could be a replaced hard drive, or I might just apply the image over the top of my existing operating system if it was corrupt or beyond repair somehow. Okay, and then here we see the system rebooting. It automatically loads the Acronis loader, which just kind of went off the screen there. Let me try to bring this back in so we can see it. There we go. And we see that it's starting to load. Really, that's pretty much all it's going to do at this point. Now it's going to go ahead and load its own software, and then it will reference the image that I did offline here, the backup that I created at an earlier point in time. Now you can see that it's starting to recover all of that information. Okay, that'll just take a while. I mean, it takes somewhat. It's disk-intensive, of course, because it's backing up or restoring the entire hard drive. But overall, it's pretty efficient. And at this point, I know that I'll get back to a known good operating system. So it's good for recovery and repair, and it's also very good, of course, for deployment. I can take that image and deploy it just the way you see right here. I could take the Acronis CD or DVD and boot from it. And they also have several network options as well, server-level products where you can do mass deployments all at once as well. And again, sysprep is going to be important to be able to make each individual system unique. And then back over here on our original whiteboard, notice that I did have in parentheses out here the word sysprep. What in the world is that about? Well, you see, each computer has uniquely identifiable information in its installation. So, for example, each computer, even in a home network, would have unique identifiers. The key here, though, as it relates to sysprep, is corporate computers. Because when they join a domain, in Windows, an Active Directory domain, then they get unique identifiers known as a SID. Okay, both the user account gets a unique SID and the computer account gets a unique SID. And in fact, the computer that I'm recording on right now, I just derived this out of Active Directory. dsget is something that we can use to pull information out of Active Directory. My computer's a member of a domain, and you don't need to memorize any of this for exam purposes. I'm just proving that I have a unique identifier. But dsget computer, then the common name of my computer, actually this is the full distinguished name of my computer. I tell the dsget command that I want to find the SID for this computer right here, and it shows the unique SID that I have. Okay, there should be no other computer on the planet that has these exact same combinations of letters and numbers. Okay, this should be the only computer that has this. Now, the problem comes in with this. What if I were to use Acronis or Ghost and take an image of my exact hard drive and then apply that image to some other computer so that I now had two computers on the network with the exact same SID? By the way, there's other unique identifiers as well, IP address information, computer naming information, a GUID. So there's a lot of unique identifiers there. Well, and now if I have two computers that look exactly the same to Active Directory, that'll cause a lot of problems and would be definitely a bad situation to be in. So in corporate environments, if they use imaging, where they take this computer that we're looking at right now, and they say, hey, this is the perfect computer. It has all all of the applications we like. It has all of the updates. Everything's working fine. We want to take an image of it and deploy that image to 100 other computers. So we don't have to go through the next finish of installing all of those other computers. We just apply the image. Well, that would be great unless they all had the same SID. Then we would have a huge headache. And that's where sysprep comes in. You can use sysprep a couple of different ways. You can go sysprep, and then I'll show you the question mark with this. This will just pop up the help. But what I could do is do sysprep /generalize. And what that would do is it would strip away all the unique characteristics like the unique SID and GUID and computer name and those sorts of things. And then I would take a snapshot of it, or I would take an image of it just like I'm doing right now using Acronis. Okay? Because with all that unique information gone, I could then apply that to all of my destination computers, like 100 other computers. Then when they got turned back on again and I booted those machines, then they would have to generate their own uniqueness information, and that's what I would want to happen. The other thing I could do here is just type in sysprep, and that will bring up this interface, which is also certainly something I can use, but I would just choose generalize, and then I would specify what I want to do when I'm done using sysprep. Okay, so that's just another way of going about it. You don't need to memorize all of that stuff regarding GUIDs or SIDs or how to get them. You don't need to memorize all the syntax for sysprep either. Just know that, and this is important, just know that it kind of generalizes or makes each computer generic enough so that I could then take an image of it and deploy it to many other machines without causing conflicts in Active Directory. Now, some computers will also include with them a recovery CD. So if you go down to the electronics store and you buy a new laptop or a new desktop, in the package of all the manuals and all that, you'll probably find a CD, and that might say something like recovery CD or similar verbiage on it. What this is used for is that, let's say you got a wicked bad virus or something on your hard drive, or maybe the hard drive failed and the manufacturer, maybe it's under warranty, they sent you a replacement. Well, what you would do is you'd put that new hard drive in, and then you would boot from the recovery CD. There will be promptings in a menu system there that will say, hey, would you like to reapply the original factory image to your hard drive? You would say yes, and then once you rebooted that computer, it would be exactly the same as when you first picked it up from the computer store. It'll take you probably through a little wizard asking you to put your name in and maybe register the computer and all that kind of stuff. But that's what a recovery CD is used for. Now, it depends kind of also on the context. This is what would come from a vendor. Okay. You may also have a recovery CD from a imaging manufacturer like Ghost or Acronis. They'll probably call it something else, but it can generally be considered the same thing, because if I want to apply an image to maybe a blank hard drive, then I might boot to my Ghost or Acronis CD, and then point it to where the image is that I've created at some previous point in time to apply to my new hard drive. And then there's also a recovery partition. Many organizations or many vendors will use those in addition to or instead of a recovery CD. And what you'll often do with this is, in the manual, it'll tell you a certain key combination to press, for example, I don't know, Shift F12 or something like that, on boot. And when you do that, it'll boot to the recovery partition. Normally, this will be a hidden partition that you cannot see any other way. But what it'll do is that when you boot to that recovery partition, it'll give you similar options to what you'd have on the recovery CD. There'll be a menu option. You'll be able to choose that I want to recover the entire hard drive or something like that. And then again, you can apply it, and it will again be as good as new once you've done so. Let's also take a look at a few installation notes that don't really have a big category of their own, but kind of miscellaneous items that we can identify. One of those would be the log files. If you're having persistent and troubling problems with your installations, then you might want to go to the log files. Now, this would be, of course, the case if the installation completes successfully, but there's something that's kind of halfway done or not installed properly. Then you can go into the C drive, in most installations anyway. That's usually where it goes installed. And then go to the Windows directory, and then let me change my view here so we can see things a little bit better. And you'll see a number of different files, and just look for these text files, and you can kind of tell by the icon there that they're text files. These will end in .log. And if you were to view the file extensions of these. But this would show, for example, all the setup actions that took place during setup. Now, a lot of this is kind of indecipherable to mere humans, but if you were to work with a developer that wanted to understand why the installation wasn't working properly with their devices, for example, or with their software, whatever it was, then a lot of that would appear in this as well. If you had any errors in the setup, that would appear in the setup error log right here. I don't think I have any on this one. Yeah, there's none in this one. And there's a number of other logs that appear there as well, depending upon the need that you have to identify specific problems. But the main thing to keep in mind there is that the log files do appear by default in the Windows directory. Now, another thing you want to do, of course, is to make sure that after installation that the drivers have been properly installed or that your devices have been properly detected. And if I go into my computer here, I can right-click on the computer to look at Device Manager by going to Manage on this right-click item. Having done that in approving of user account control, if we go into Device Manager, we'll notice that there are any devices that have not been properly detected with the yellow exclamation point kind of thing. And in fact, here we go right here. By the way, another telltale device of the problem I've got with my multimedia audio controller is this red X on the little speaker icon down in the tray area. So we can tell right away there's something wrong with that. Then there's also this base system device. This is usually going to be something like chipset, a chipset from the motherboard. Okay, in this particular case, I'm actually working with VMware, and if I drag this down, you can see that. Yeah, that's actually a VMware machine we're working on. I called it bare metal because I just installed it from bare metal. Bare metal is another expression that we sometimes use to mention that there was not an existing operating system, there was nothing on the hard drive, it was just a bare metal install. Now, if this is a physical hardware machine, instead of a virtualized one, very often what I would do is I would download the audio controllers from the motherboard manufacturer, especially if they're integrated into the motherboard, or I'd download them from Creative Labs or whoever made my audio controller. And then I just right-click here to choose Update Driver Software, and then I could browse for wherever I downloaded that software. You could also search automatically for updated driver software, which will also use Microsoft's own Windows Update. But again, I prefer to use the manufacturer's version instead. Also, there's this base system device. I might have mentioned this earlier, but that would be normally something associated with the chipset, so definitely you'd have to download that from the motherboard manufacturer or from the manufacturer of the computer. In this case, if I install a set of tools and utilities from VMware known as VMware Tools, it also includes the drivers that resolve these issues. In similar fashion, you may have other devices that are also not properly detected, especially maybe something like a multifunction printer that was still attached to the computer or something like this. Then you probably want to install the software that comes with that device because it'll usually include utilities as well as the appropriate software for the drivers here. Now, just as an FYI here as well, I've already actually applied VMware Tools, and I've been using snapshots to go back and forth. So, for example, I'm going to click on my Snapshot Manager within VMware. This is not an A+ exam objective item, but this will help you because you're likely to use VMware or some other virtualization technology to do your own testing and so forth. This snapshot right here is the machine we're looking at right here in the background. Okay, but I took a snapshot of it, and then I downloaded and I installed VMware Tools, and when I was done, I went back into Device Manager, and that's what Snapshot 4 is. So I'm going to go to that. This just helps me in terms of saving time and being quick and efficient in going to different iterations of this computer. Now you can see here that indeed after I've installed VMware Tools, and there's an icon for VMware Tools down here, that indeed my audio is fine. You know, everything looks just fine. I got my little speaker icon down here. So if I've got my sound and VMware audio is working and everything looks just fine. Now, all that stuff that I showed you with VMware and snapshots, you don't need to memorize that again for the A+ exam, but just as a practical matter, that will probably help you quite a lot in your daily productivity. Also, when you're doing your installation, especially if it's for 2000 or XP, you'll see a notice there early on that says press F6 for drivers. Again, that's for any controllers that you've installed that don't have drivers in the bits for XP or 2000. So there's no way that it can recognize the controller, therefore it'll never see a hard drive. Same would be true of any RAID arrays or RAID cards that you have. This might also be true of SATA cards that you might have as well. So by way of example, let's take a look at how that would look. And in Vista, you'll see that, as I showed you that earlier when we did a clean install. In Vista, you'll see there's an option there to load drivers when it shows you all the available drives in the system. But here, as we take a look at this, you can see down at the bottom there it says press F6 if you need to install a third-party driver, and it goes by pretty quick. So sometimes it's quite easy to miss. But you do have to press F6 right at that moment, and then it will prompt you to supply the drivers on a floppy disk or what have you. Also, with Windows 2000, you could use an ERD disk. This is an emergency repair disk, and this is something that you could create using the backup utility if you don't already have one. It's a floppy disk, and it's useful for reconstructing or replacing corrupt or missing system files from the operating system. And this is kind of a last-ditch effort many times, but if the operating system is somehow corrupt, this will allow you to work in conjunction with the source files on the CD and then replace the missing or corrupt ones in the operating system. Also, you could do a dual boot. Now, this is nowhere near as popular as it used to be because we have virtualization, and I showed you that a moment ago. I can have, in terms of the number of machines I can have running simultaneously on one set of hardware. I could probably have 5, 6 different machines running at once. I got 8 gigs of RAM, plenty of processing power, and so they can all share the existing resources here locally. But in the old days, we didn't really have virtualization, or it wasn't as popular or as trusted. So if you wanted to have XP and 2000, guess what? You had to have 2 separate physical machines. Well, not everybody can afford 2 separate physical machines, or has the space or the other practical limitations there. So you might have one physical computer, and you just want to be able to dual boot. Some days you want XP, some days you want 2000, and sometimes that was necessary for a support desk as well, so that they could run multiple different operating systems to support users that were using either operating system. So with a dual boot, what happens here is it's recommended that you use NTFS. That's just kind of a default recommendation for just about anything. But you'll see that, I think the A plus kind of thinking would always recommend NTFS for a dual boot scenario. So just keep that in mind. Okay. And then the boot INI file is what actually controls the dual boot scenario. And if you're adept at editing the boot INI file, you can certainly edit that file on your own as an administrator. Otherwise, you can use the System Properties interface to be able to adjust that as well. Let me show you that. All right, for example, here I'm running Windows XP Professional, and if I just go to the computer and to the C drive, we're going to show the contents of this folder. And right now, we don't see the boot INI file, but if I go into my View and then Show Hidden Files and Folders, and then not hide protected operating system files and folders, and I get a warning there because it wants to prevent me from accidentally hurting myself by editing these things when I shouldn't. Then we see the boot file there. We don't see the extension, but it's a boot.ini file. And in this particular machine, we actually have the ability to work with the default installation of Windows, which you can see would be identified right here. That's how it'll look in the interface. Or we could use the Microsoft Windows Recovery Console. We'll talk more about the Recovery Console at a future point in time. But this is another way that I can help ailing operating systems that may not boot properly or have other catastrophic problems. Anyway, it's a very similar thing to what I would have in a dual boot scenario. In fact, this actually is kind of a dual boot. I can boot to my normal Windows operating system or to a special operating system that's used for recovery purposes. If I had also had Windows Vista here, for example, then it might also have an additional line for Windows Vista, or actually Windows 2000 or something like that. So you can flip back and forth between the multiple operating systems, and you would just edit that boot INI file, or more likely, you'll go into the properties by right-clicking my computer and choosing properties that you saw me just do right there. Then you'd go to Advanced, Startup and Recovery, go to the settings down here at the bottom. Having clicked on that, you would then select which one you wanted to be the default operating system. So here it says XP Professional. This might easily say also Windows 2000 if I wanted that to be the default. I would select that item, and then we would, on reboot, it would show that option as the default operating system. You can also specify how long it shows the display of the operating system as well. And also be aware of the fact that with a dual boot scenario, you want to install the oldest operating system first. So if I've got Windows 2000 installed on the computer, but I want to dual boot with Windows XP, then I'd start with 2000, and it would be, let's say, on one hard drive or partition, okay, one hard drive or volume. With XP, it would have to be installed on a separate volume, a separate partition, or a separate hard drive. I could not install XP on the same partition, okay, or the same volume. The reason for that is because that would essentially wind up being an upgrade, wouldn't it? Well, that's not what I'm trying to do. So I'd have to install it separately here, and that would be on its own, hard drive down here. And then one of the hard drives, normally it's going to be the first hard drive that was in the system, or the first volume, will have the boot data on it as well. And the boot data, that's where the boot INI file, boot.ini file would appear, and that would have reference to 2000, have reference to XP, and that's where I would make the selection on the boot. And then there's also something here called a repair install. This actually can really save your hide sometimes. If the operating system is really totally corrupt and really having serious problems, but you don't want to have to reinstall all of the applications or recover all of the data, then what you can do is to boot from, let's say, the Windows XP CD, and then in the installation process, you can specify that you want to do a repair install. What it will do is it will check for all of the system files and replace any of those files, and but it will retain all of your applications and all of your data. Then by way of example there, once again here, I'm booting from the CD-ROM drive. Now, I'm choosing that option manually here because it's likely that if XP is already installed, that it's going to just boot right from the hard drive, and I'm going to get right back to the corrupt operating system that I'd had. Okay, then we'll go ahead and continue on through the process here, and we'll see then that I'll be able to choose a repair option here. I'll show it to you in a moment. All right, and here we are. Here it says, welcome to setup, and we see that we can set up Windows XP now by pressing enter, repair it with using the recovery console, so we'd press R, or to quit setup, press F3. Now, the thing here is, sometimes people get this confused. They say, well, I want a repair installation, and then down here, you can see down towards the bottom it says R equals repair. So I'm going to press R. That's not what we actually want in this instance. We could repair it using the recovery console, but if you want to repair it by doing just a reinstallation over your existing installation of Windows and retain all of your applications and data, then just continue on as if it were a normal setup in this window. So I'll press enter to continue on in the setup. And then once I agree to the license agreement, and I'll just press F8 to agree to this, then what we'll do here is where we want to press a R now. Okay, now here is where I'm going to press R to repair my existing Windows installation. That's different than the recovery console, and that's an important distinction to make. So I press R, and from that point forward, it would continue on with a repair installation. Now let's also take a look at some additional installation options. I've already addressed some of these, but some of these I haven't. One of those that I haven't talked about yet, really, is an attended or manual installation versus unattended. Now, the attended is what you saw me do when I installed Windows Vista. Just kind of a next finish as you answer questions and go along. The unattended would require certain tools to be able to create. What we want to come up with is a file called, and I'll put this down at the bottom here because I'm running out of room, unattend.txt. Okay, it doesn't actually have to be called that, but normally when you see it in documentation and so forth, that's what it's called. Otherwise, you can really call it whatever you want to. But this simply has all of the answers that we would normally supply in an attended installation in this file, and then when we perform our installation, we might do something like this. So maybe you're installing Windows XP. If you were at a command line, maybe you're doing a manual installation, you would type something like win-nt, and then you would follow that with a / U for unattend. And then the answer file would be, after that, okay? So that's one way of doing that. The unattend.txt file, or whatever you decide to name it, you just have to make sure that that's accessible at the time of installation. Another way of doing that, though, is instead of naming this unattend.txt, you can use another file name called, let's just write it down here, wint.sif. And if you put that file, it'll have the same answers as this. You create it using the same utility, which would be Setup Manager. When you create this file and put it at the root of removable media, then it will read that and supply all the answers as well. So the automated installations are pretty useful if you need to go through maybe a whole department and you need to perform a true installation on each one. Maybe you don't want to use imaging for whatever reason. Then this might be a good way to get that all launched with requiring the least amount of manual intervention. Now, for more current operating systems like Windows Server 2008 or Windows Vista or Windows 7, you'll use a different tool, and that one's called Windows System Image Manager, or WSIM. I'll just abbreviate that out here, WSIM, Windows System Image Manager. And this is part of the Windows, let me make a better W there, Windows Automated Installation Kit. Now, do you need to memorize any of this stuff I've shown you here? No. I'm just providing extra information because I don't want to just drop this on you and leave it at that. I feel like in a practical way, you need to know a little bit more about it, but not for A+ exam objectives. Also, partitioning. I already addressed this a little bit when we talked about the installation earlier, but the official kind of A+ answer is that you need to create the partition first, then you format it, and then you install the operating system on it. But once again, the more current operating systems such as Vista or Windows 7 or 2008, they can all use just a raw hard drive with no partitions at all, and they'll format them themselves. If you don't mind it using all the available space, because that's what it will do, it'll use all that space. Now, another option, though, with partitioning is that you might want to divide the operating system and the data onto separate partitions. Why would you want to do that? Well, if this is where my OS is, and maybe the rest of this is for data, and then if the OS gets corrupt or there's a catastrophic problem with the OS itself, then I still have my data. Now, there's got some limited advantages there, because very often what will happen with this kind of situation is there's a problem with the hard drive, and if the hard drive fails, you lose both the operating system and the data. But sometimes people do recommend splitting those up, and there is some some narrow degree of opportunity or advantage by splitting those up. Okay. Also, with the file system, generally speaking, you want to use NTFS. There's very little, if any, reason to use FAT32 anymore. So just use NTFS. That's pretty much the bottom line with that one. Also, the product key and the activation, we talked about that earlier as well. Remember, with previous versions of the operating system, such as Windows 2000, you have to put in a product key to even be able to continue with the installation process. However, with current versions of Windows, like Vista or Windows 7 or 2008, then you don't have to do that. You can leave those blank just as on a temporary basis. Okay. However, they do have to be activated at some point in the future, and in order to get activated, you do have to eventually put in a valid product key. Alright, that's it for this particular nugget, but I still got some more work to do. I'm going to record some other video, which you'll look at for later on in this series. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit tired, so I'm going to have to go down to Starbucks and get myself a low-calorie, quad venti extra caramel macchiato. Wow. As if that's going to help anything. Gee, my waistline's growing faster than the internet. Anyway, now unfortunately I have to go 5 miles further to a different Starbucks than the one I used to go to, for obvious reasons. Alright, in this nugget, we took a look at installation, and this was part 2. We started off by talking about the installation media. We could do it from a CD or a DVD, that's the most common method, remember? But for corporations, you're probably more likely to use something like Windows Deployment Services or some kind of imaging technology. We also took a look at some installation notes, such as where the log files are found, and we also looked at some of the installation options, such as the fact that you can use an unattended installation. And we also talked about the file system and partitioning, as well as the product key and activation. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.